welcome to tonight's Town Hall budget meeting of the West Orange Board of Education. Mr. Calavano.
Mr. Alper.
Here.
Mrs. Merklinger.
Here.
Mr. Rothstein.
Here.
Mrs. Trigg-Scales.
Here.
Mrs. Tunnicliffe.
Here.
Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge
Allegiance to the flag
of the
United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Notice of meeting. Please take notice that adequate notice of this meeting has been provided for in the following manner. That a written notice was sent from the Office of the Secretary of the Board at 4 p.m. on November 24th and December 3rd, 2020. That said notice was sent by regular mail to the West Orange Township Clerk and the editors of the West Orange Chronicle and the Star Ledger. That said notice is posted in the lobby administration building of the Board of Education.
All right, great. If we could get the presentation up on screen, we'll get that going. Great. So welcome to our town hall on budget priorities. The purpose, you can go to the next one. The purpose is to provide an overview of the budget process for the public and to help people really understand how this works. You know, generally the public doesn't get to be involved in the budget process until really March. When we first present the preliminary budget to the public. And, you know, at that point, the administration's usually been working on it since December or so. The board usually comes into the process more like February or so. So the idea this year is that we're going to be able to give the community some really early insights into this coming year's budget. We'll be able to listen to the community and you'll be able to understand a bit of what goes into this process. This is the first of 2 town hall meetings we have planned for this school year. It's part of one of our board goals this year to increase parent and community engagement. So this meeting in the fall, obviously, to identify our budget priorities, and then in the spring, we're going to talk about goal setting for the board for the year. The outcome here is that hopefully the board and the super will have a better understanding of what matters to the community when it comes to the budget, and it'll inform the board's deliberations as we work to develop the final budget for this coming year. So we're going to begin with this presentation from the board and administration. Then we're going to have public comment on the budget only. We'll have a second public comment period later in the meeting for any other topics. We're experimenting with the town hall format for this tonight. The goal is that we'll be able to listen, but because we're doing this as a town hall and not more of the traditional format, and we'll talk more about that in a bit, there will be some ability to do real-time response and discussion when it makes sense during those comments. The meeting will be recorded, posted to the website, and if you want to get in touch with us about anything that you don't have time to do, or if you're watching this on the recording, you can get our email addresses for the board and the superintendent right on the website.
Thanks, Ken. So welcome everyone. I'm Cheryl Merklinger, for those of you that don't know me already, and I'm part of the Public Relations Committee along with Gary Rothstein, my peer board member. And we're going to kind of take you through this presentation along with Dr. C and John Calavano, along with Ken Alper, Terry Trigg-Scales, and Jennifer Tunnicliffe. So if you have any questions, again, our email addresses are there. And we just hope that you'll be, we want to hear from you. So we hope that tonight is engaging for yourselves and that you participate and ask the questions, because this is really all about the community. So one of the main priorities of the Board of Education, for those that are not aware, in addition to policy and reviewing those policies, is our financial responsibility. So our financial responsibility is to ensure financial integrity of the district by providing a thorough and efficient education at a price the community can afford.
Thank you, Cheryl. And so there's a potential tension between providing that thorough and efficient education and also doing so at a price the community can afford, which means that our values and our priorities come into play. And I think we can all agree that the number one priority for us is providing an outstanding education for all of our students. But then there are a number of other priorities that all feed into what creates a great education and what creates a great school district. So there's many options listed here. There are others that we didn't include. What we're hoping, as Cheryl mentioned a moment ago, is that when we get to the public comment section, you will be prepared to share with us what your priorities are, and we can carry that forward with us. Please, perfect. Thank you so much. So with so many competing issues, we're going to confront all of these issues as we work toward getting to a final budget next spring. So we have, of course, the rising costs of labor, benefits, and insurance, and these are things that impact all businesses and all public institutions, of course. Facilities upgrades, which is particularly expensive as we're dealing with aging buildings and the need to keep up. Safety and security. This is both physical safety and security, but also technology. And these, of course, everyone is aware, have become issues so much more significant than ever before and so much more expensive. State aid, which is at the moment inadequate, and Mr. Alper will go into that in a little more detail momentarily in an upcoming slide. And then, of course, taxpayer concerns. Taxpayers have a number of concerns when it comes to our school district. Obviously, everybody wants us to have a great school system and a great school district. There's also concerns about costs, and costs this year is an incredibly intense situation. COVID-19 has wreaked havoc on all of our lives. So many families have been impacted and had loss of income. And so this will certainly be a challenging year for all of us.
So part of those, our funding sources come from our local property taxes. And many of you know that 60 to 65% of your taxes go towards the school district for those that are taxpayers in West Orange. There's also state aid that we receive, federal funding, and then grants, which we're hoping, to increase each year. And Dr. C has been great on working on those grants for us. But this is just to give you an idea of the numbers that we're looking at.
So state aid, my favorite topic. It's like Cheryl just showed us, there's $18.6 million in anticipated state aid in this coming budget. It's important to understand how state aid works. Invariably somebody will say, but your state aid went up $1.5 million this year. Why do you need to raise taxes or cut programs or do both of those things, right? It's really important to understand that our state aid, it's not a bonus. It's not found money that's coming from the state. It's part of our revenue that we're expecting and that we're really owed. The way this comes about, just to give you a quick run through of the process, there were a lot of attempts over a lot of years to figure out how to give state aid to school districts in New Jersey. Most of them were found to be unconstitutional, but finally in 2008, they came up with the School Funding Reform Act, the SFRA. It barely passed, and we'll talk about that in a second. It's important. But as it says on the slide, it was enacted to determine the amount of state school aid each district would receive based on the needs of the student population and the local fiscal capacity. So what's that mean, right? So what the state does is for every district in the state, it figures out and assigns what it calls an adequacy budget to every district based on your students, the specific kids you have in your district. So they're looking to see how many kids you have in various special education categories, English language learners, kids who are in other programs, kids who are in no programs, the number. They're going to say, this is what we think you need in West Orange to give your kids a thorough and efficient education. Not necessarily a great education, not necessarily a perfect education, but an adequate education. Just for round numbers, just say that the state says that's $100 million in West Orange. It's not, but just say that it is. The state also goes and figures out what our local fair share is supposed to be. And that's simply by looking at our property values in town and the average incomes in town and things like that, what the state thinks our taxpayers can be fairly asked to spend. So let's say that the state thinks that we can come up with $70 million in local property taxes. So what's supposed to happen next is they subtract your local fair share from your adequacy budget, and they say, okay, to give their kids an adequate education of $100 million, they're going to kick in 70, and the state's going to, we the taxpayers will kick in 70, and we in the state will kick in 30. Well, That's how it's supposed to work, but it never worked that way. Remember, it only passed by a whisker. And the reason it passed was because they came up with something called adjustment aid. So there were all these districts that were going to lose a lot of money when the 2008 bill came into effect, because it was now a formula-based process where they looked at the specific kids you had. A lot of districts didn't have those kids anymore. Their enrollment had declined over the years. Some were set to lose $25, $50 million all at once, which it doesn't work, right? So in order to make sure that their legislators voted for this thing, they said, all right, we're going to give you adjustment aid for a period of time so you can adjust to the new situation, and eventually we'll phase it out. Of course, politics being politics, nobody ever phased it out. So 10 years later, it was 2018. West Orange was getting, I think, about $8 million in state aid that year, but we were supposed to be getting 26. So we were getting about 33 cents on the dollar. Meanwhile, districts like Brick down in Ocean County, Brick this past year, we got 47% in West Orange. It has been improving. Brick got 267% of what they were supposed to get because they still have adjustment aid. So the reason this is now being fixed is in 2018, they passed this S2 bill, which created a 7-year process where adjustment aid would be phased out, and the people who were underrated like West Orange would get their money little by little over those 7 years. I think COVID has probably messed with that schedule a bit. It's not going to work exactly the way it was supposed to, but we're on target. We're about right now at about half of what we're supposed to get. So we're getting there, but every penny that we get in that state aid is critical. And like I said, the difference in the state aid from last year to this year, that's not a bonus, that's expected money that we're counting on because we're owed it. And it's important to understand also the SFRA has never been fully funded. They say that it's about $1 billion a year shortfall. So, even if the aid allocations were exactly right, we still wouldn't be getting what we're supposed to because they're not starting with enough money at the beginning. The other thing worth pointing out is that every year, the state aid allocations, we know what they're supposed to be, but they can change, and they're not final until the governor gives his annual budget address in late February. So a lot of the budget work is done every year before we really know the amount that's coming in. So always a challenge.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so we've talked a little bit about where our funding and our revenues come in from. Now the question about where they go to. The chart that you're looking at here is not West Orange specific. This is an average across New Jersey school districts. And it's intended just to give a general idea that for the most part, 80% of our budgets go to salary and benefits, 15% program and operations, and that leaves 5% that's discretionary spending. So when we start looking at ways that we can find savings in our budget, ways that we can make cuts, what really becomes clear quickly is there's not a lot of wiggle room here. Any cuts that are made are almost certainly going to be painful. And they'll be painful because any place that we make that cut is going to have an impact either directly on program offerings or it's going to have an impact on staff. And that's going to impact our ability in order to provide what we believe to be the best education. As we've mentioned a couple of times here, we have a responsibility to provide an adequate education, but these cuts certainly can become painful as we start looking into what exactly it means to bring our budget under control once we know what those state aid numbers are going to be.
So that takes us to, once we looking at the budget, what are our options for balancing it? And so there's a couple of things that come to the table, and that's budget cuts, tax increases, or a combination of the two, both of those. Neither, which is fun for the board nor the administration to have to do. Examples, are listed here. In the past 2 years, we had $10.5 million in cuts and then a $3.4 million tax increase. So we use a combination of both as our approach thus far. So just those are what we're looking at right now.
Okay, so here I wanted to show our current budget, the expenditure side of our current budget, what is basically made up of salary and benefits and all the rest of the categories. If you compare this to the final presentation last year, you'll see a difference of $1.5 million less because that additional state aid that we did receive during the year. It was actually taken back in July because of COVID and the financial situation of the state. So we actually lost that. So I guess at this point, we're hoping at least to get that. I don't think we're going to get that plus our next year's share of what we're entitled to, but we're hopefully counting on the additional $1.5 million. So this year we wanted to look at some major categories for increases to see where we stand. So if everything remained the same as the current year's budget, and we looked at salary, benefits, transportation out of district, where are we with these categories? So salaries, all our bargaining units are currently in negotiations. And so we anticipated a salary increase for all, including training levels, meaning that for staff members that receive additional credits, college credits, you can move across the guides, which will increase your salary. So you could be on a BA step or an MA step. So there are individuals that will be moving from one guide to another. So we anticipated those changes, and also those staff members that are eligible for longevity for the first time, or they're eligible for a second, jump in their longevity. So we also know who they are. So that comes to about $3.9 million. For benefits, again, we're really early in the stage trying to get some numbers, but our medical's at 11%, prescription at 14%, and dental at 9%. And those are the figures that represent a percentage increase. Transportation, we looked at, and our main vendor, the Hunterdon County Ed Services Commission, we had a discussion with them, and they're looking at a 26% increase. So we wanted to know why. And we actually sat down with them, and for the past 3 years, they were actually running a deficit by transporting our students. Back in 17-18, they were about a $504,000 deficit. In 18-19, they were about $425,000 deficit. And now 19-20, they were looking at somewhere about $120,000 deficit. So what they did for the 21-22 school year, they looked at their expenses, they looked at the revenue that they were anticipating, and then they came up short. So then to make that shortfall, they decided that the 26% increase should bring them whole, not going back to the other 3 years looking for the deficit that they encountered, just trying to make their whole in the current year that they're in now. And then our out of district tuition, it's a little early, but we anticipated an 8% increase. We will actually get a schedule from the Department of Education with their increases, and we could see increases at 15%, 10%, 12%. They have no caps for special ed tuition for the like the local school districts have. So at this point, we're anticipating 8%. So before we even get started, without any new programs, any new textbooks, any new anything, we are at a deficit of $8.1 million.
Mr. Calavano, just go back to that previous slide for a sec. And that 8.1 approximately is based upon the fact that we get the 1.5 additional state aid. If we were not to get that, then that bottom line would jump by 1.5. And obviously, if we were to have state aid cut, it would go up even further. So I just wanted to note that.
It's actually indicated on this slide, 21-22 budget scenarios. So if you look at, we'll just take the first two as example. If you want to have a 0% increase in your tax levy without the additional $1.5 million that we're hoping to receive in state aid, we're looking at a cut of $9.5 million. But if we do receive that $1.5 million, we're looking at less than 1.5 from the 9.5, which is $8 million. And I wanted to show you what a 1% increase in tax levy would be, and also 2% in the tax levy, what that would be. So if the board decided to do a 2% increase and we received the $1.5 million, we still have to cut $5.2 million to balance the budget. So we talked about bank cap on one of the previous slides. So each year, you can increase your operating tax levy by 2%. And there's some other adjustments that if you're eligible for, you can actually go over the 2%. So when you don't come to cap or you don't use your adjustments, those adjustments or that dollar amount is actually put into a bank cap, into a bank. So that means for the 2018-19, we were $3.4 million that we could have went to cap and we did not. So that's reserved now for us to pull out and use in the next 3 budget years. So that $3.4 million will expire in the 21-22 budget. And the 19-20 budget, the 2019-20 budget, we were $1.2 million on the cap. That amount now can be used this current budget coming up in 2021 or the 22-23 budget, but that will expire in the 22-23. So we have the ability to increase our 2% tax levy by additional $4.6 million. And what that means is by increasing the tax levy, this is not state aid, this is not additional funding, this is just the ability to go over the 2%, exceed the 2%, and it's a direct hit on the taxpayers.
I'm sorry, can you go back one slide again for a moment? Mr. Calvano, I just wanted to ask for clarification because I know this term banked cap is always confusing. The $3.4 million from the 2018-19 year, that's not money that's sitting in an account somewhere. That's just that we have the ability to, if needed, put basically charge that in taxes on top of the 2% increase.
Right. It's basically going beyond the 2% cap by $3.4 million. Correct. And that will be raised by taxation.
Thank you. I muted myself and it's my turn to speak again. Okay, so just a little bit about timeline for the budget process. Right now we're in this first step over here, initial planning, as Mr. Calvano was just walking us through. The Board of Education is listening to the community, sharing information, and getting prepared for really digging in on the budget. In February to March of next year, we're going to receive those state aid numbers that Mr. Alper mentioned, and that's going to give us the ability to move forward with a little more clarity on what our actual numbers are. The administration is going to propose the budget. There's going to be a number of meetings and discussions and revisions, and we'll eventually have to come to an agreement and submit those numbers to the county superintendent of schools. We require their approval. Is that correct, Mr. Calvano?
Correct. Twice. The preliminary budget, they'll have to approve, and then the final budget.
The final one. And the final one goes after that preliminary budget in April and May. We'll have some more special meetings, special budget meetings for the public, talk more about the final budget, approve it, and then it goes again to the county superintendent. So mostly just wanted everyone to know we're starting the process now. There's a lot to talk about over the upcoming months. And of course, we hope that everyone will remain involved as we continue to work through this process.
So part of our budget, or part of our Board of Ed goals, includes the budget process. And so we listed here what our budget goals are, which is to continue to provide funding to maintain a safe environment in all buildings, reduce the amount of fund balance utilized to balance the budget, optimize district spending, and of course to evaluate the district's expenditures. And I can tell you that, you know, as a board, we come prepared to every single one of these meetings with these big binders. I myself have Post-it notes on, you know, all through my binder and questioning, and it's a really difficult process, and we have pressure and you know, put the heat a little bit on Mr. Calvano and the administration on, you know, exactly what these cuts are, or, you know, where we're spending money. So I can tell you that it's definitely taken very seriously, and it's definitely a difficult process. But we just want you to be aware that this is part of our budget, or part of our goals as the Board of Education.
All right, so in just a little while, we'll start the public comment section on just the budget. Like I said before, it's going to be a town hall format. You know, I want to be clear about this. This is new for us, and, you know, this isn't a regular meeting. You know, typically a Board of Education meeting, it's not actually a meeting of the Board of Education with the public. It's a meeting of the Board of Education that just happens to be held in public so the public can see what the board does. In this case, it actually is more of a meeting with the public, and that's why we'll be able to have any board member jump in and respond and actually have real-time conversations when necessary. So we'll see how that goes. At the very least, we may be able to, you'll be able to get your questions answered sooner instead of having to wait till the end. So the process for participating is the same as in any other meeting. Just raise your hand when you come in, let us know your name and address for the record, and you'll have your 3 minutes. And remember, you get one chance to comment here, and then there'll be another public comment period later in the meeting, which I think is on another slide.
They can go back. Go back one more, I think.
Nope.
Yeah. It's
Right. I finished this one, and then I wasn't sure if somebody was going to say anything about the other one. So after the regular public comment, there's the regular public comment, which will be just like ever on any topic at all that you'd like to participate on. And that works the same way. Cheryl.
So I think we're going to jump to public comment now. So.
All right. So anybody who has a question or a comment, please go ahead and raise your hand and then follow the instructions.
Hello. Good evening.
Well, go ahead and introduce yourself and your address, please.
Hi, good evening. My name is Melinda Huerta. I wasn't sure if you could hear me. I'm sorry. 17 Park Drive South. I had a couple of questions. When will is there a projected date of when the budget will be finalized? And if so, when on the next question was, when will taxpayers see an increase if we were to approve, if the budget was to, if the board was to approve an increase in the taxes? When would taxpayers see that increase? The next question I had, I did notice on the budget, there were at-risk programs. What can you give some examples of what those at-risk programs are? And then there, for the allotted money for charter schools, do we have an estimate of how many students, either number or percentage wise, there are in charter schools? And that's my questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you. The date for the final budget, the final budget is usually due to the county in early May. I don't know if that date's public yet, but it's usually right around May 4th, May 5th, somewhere around there, I would say. Mr. Calavano, I think you can probably speak to when that hits the tax bill, which quarter that the changes first come to.
I'm sorry. So it'll be the third quarter of 2021. That's you'll see the increase. Because our school budget is based on a fiscal year, which is July to June, and taxes are struck on a calendar year. And usually you have the first two quarters that are estimates, and then the third and fourth are based on actuals. So you'll see the actual hit in that third quarter. Regarding charter schools, we have 13 students going to 6 charter schools. For now, the current total is $266,937. So it did jump from the budgeted number.
Such a scam.
And then for some of the programs regarding Title I, Title II, we have Title I, we're funding an intervention teacher salary at Hazel in Washington. Title II is we're funding an instructional reading coach at Gregory, and it's also there's funds available for professional development. Title III, we're actually funding Fast Forward program for ESL students. And Title IV, we're looking at the after-school virtual learning community for all elementary students and the after-school homework academy for Hazel.
All right, anyone else with anything on that?
Okay, the next person is Tez Roro. Tez Roro, if you could state your address for the record, please. There we
Hello.
go.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Tess Road, 24 Hutton. Thank you very much for holding this. I appreciate the transparency. As a parent, as a homeowner who pays taxes, and also as a real estate professional, taxes are a hot topic for us. So I appreciate this. I have some questions for the transportation department that had deficit for 3 years in running. Just from a business plan perspective, I'm curious how that works. Is the contract, over multiple years? Are we getting more services than we asked for? So I'm just a little puzzled of how that works, since that seems to be the majority of the increase. And I'd love a little bit more clarification on this 4.6 million bank cap. I appreciate Gary clarifying a little bit. I'm still confused as to the 2% over, if you can just make it in simple terms, that would be great. And I apologize if I missed this, but sometimes in the general meeting agenda, I see budget line items for private schools, like those who are in West Orange, right, for security or for different things. So if you could just help us understand how that works. Last but not least, I realize we're talking about where we don't have enough funds, but I do want to bring up the pre-K expansion. I know that West Orange is one of the towns that per the state is has a budget to at least start in some capacity. I also understand that building and capacity is a problem, but I love for that to be at least part of the conversation going forward. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. I'll jump in on a couple of those. As far as the bank cap, to try to explain how that works, since it used to be the case before 2010, I think it was 2010, that each year you would come up with your school budget and it would go out to the voters who would either vote it up or down, hopefully up. And if you needed to raise taxes 6 or 7% in a year, if the voters approved it, you could. Starting in 2010, things changed. And the deal became in 2010 that if you moved your elections to November, instead of having the school board elections in April, but if you moved them to the November general election, you would be limited now to a 2% cap, but your voters wouldn't have to approve the budget. So the 2% cap means that each year your budget can be 2% higher than the previous year's budget. There's a little wiggle room in there for some certain exceptions, like if your health care costs go up and a couple of things like that, but basically it's a 2% increase. So if your budget was $100 million one year, your next year's budget could be $102 million. Now, if you do the work and you decide you don't need to use that whole potential 2% increase. So if the budget was 100 million and you the next year realize that you're able to do it for 100 million again, and you don't have to go up to 102 million, that $2 million that you had the legal right to tax in that year, the ability to tax that $2 million gets kicked down the road for up to 3 more years and then it expires. So if the next year you'd be able to go to 102 million again, because it's a 2% increase from your previous year. So in that year, if you find out that you actually need more money, you have that 2 million in banked cap, the ability to raise that extra 2 million. Hopefully that clarifies it a little bit. If not, someone else can do their spin on it, but that's how it works in my head. The private school stuff, things like security aid, the way that works is the state requires the money to be dispersed through the public school, even though it's state money that's going to the private school. I don't know why the state can't cut a check directly to the private school, but that's the state for you. So it passes through. It's not West Orange taxpayer money, and it's not Board of Education money. It's just state money that we distribute. Pre-K expansion, I think we know where that goes. We need a space. Without a space, there's nothing to expand into, and you can't use the preschool expansion funds to buy a space. I would love to know a lot more about that transportation increase myself personally. Like, speaking of business plans, how do you lose $102,000 in a year when you're not actually busing many people? You're just sitting around collecting checks. So, John or anyone else?
Hunterdon County Ed Services Commission is a local education agency, just like us. So they're a local school district. They still had to pay their employees. So really the only thing that was different is gas, wear and tear on the vehicles that they didn't have to pay. They might have got a decrease on their insurance premiums, But that's why we don't see a $400,000 or $500,000 loss as we did in the other 2 years. And I think it stems back for years, because I believe we were, and I don't have anything before 17-18 school year. Usually we enter in a 5-year contract because they have to lease a building. They have to go into negotiations with their staff. They have to have a commitment that they're going to be here for a period of time. And for a long time, the increase in their contract was only 2%. Well, they had more than 2%, just salary increases. They had to increase their driver's salaries. They were really low. They were losing drivers. They needed to buy vehicles. So it all caught up to them. And they ate the cost because they've been doing business with us, I think, since the 80s. And, they want to continue the business, but they have a local board, just like we do. And basically they said, we can't continue doing this any longer. We have to come up to at least a zero bottom line. So that's why we're seeing this 26%. This 26% is not to go back and get the deficit from the previous years. It's just to make them whole for the upcoming school year.
And I just wanted to jump in on Mr. Alper's explanation of bank cap, just because I understood what you were saying, but I think at the end, one point might have been lost, which is that in that scenario where we hadn't spent the 2%, not only would the board then be able to raise in the next year 2% more, $2 million, but the bank cap would be an additional $2 million. So it would be a total of $4 million increase in 1 year, where normally you would have only been allowed $2 million in that year. And I hope that clarifies the point a little bit, because it is a confusing topic. I know all of us at one point or another have been confused exactly about the numbers there. So if anyone else is still confused, you're not alone, and please just reach out. We can keep going over it.
Hi there. I have a question back to the transportation. Mr. Calavano, we had entertained the idea of perhaps looking at an alternative to 100 and Central. So can you tell us where we are? Why is that not a good idea?
Actually, I think if we go to use a contractor rather than another school district, we're going to see costs much higher than what we're paying right now. There are a lot of bus companies that went out of business because of COVID. And for those that want to continue in business, we're seeing that through our special education routes, that the costs are almost double of what we were paying for. So they're trying to make up their lost revenue to stay in business, so they don't fold. Their business doesn't fold. The other issue we would have too is it's a large fleet. So we would have to find someone that's pretty much local, who has a large fleet, who has all those bus drivers. We all know there's a driver shortage. And we don't want to entertain several companies, because just think about what our office would be like. We would have dispatchers from each of the companies, and someone's calling from so-and-so, and we're trying to figure out, okay, which bus company it is. So I think it doesn't work well if you have many companies doing your local gen ed routes.
Okay, anyone else need to respond, or shall I call on the next person?
John, I know that it was many years ago that we went to outsourced busing as opposed to having it in-house. I assume it saved a lot of money going out in the first place, and it would be a crazy idea to bring it back in. Does anybody ever do that? Is that something districts ever look at? Have the finances changed for some reason over the years?
No, usually if they go out, they stay out. I mean, I think we've been with Hunterdon County somewhere in the early 80s. And think about it, they're from Hunterdon County. So they're over here providing a service for us. So I don't even know how this relationship even started, but they're actually, they want to continue it. And it's not because they're making money, because if they're making money, I can understand, they want to continue this adventure, but they feel committed that they've been here this long. They want to see what they could do, with us.
Right.
Mr. Calvano, are we their only client?
In this area, they may have 1 or 2 routes with another school district, but we are their main client.
Okay.
They have a terminal out in Hunterdon County where they service a lot of Hunterdon County school districts, but for Essex County, we're it.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, it looks right now like, oh, there we go. Mr. Kramer, if you could state your address for the record. Mr. Kramer?
Adam Kramer, 20 Moran Road. I'm going to talk about some things that may be a little sensitive, but I think they have to be discussed. Most for labor. My understanding is your enrollment is going down. You can give me exact numbers, please, as to how many people have left the district as a result of COVID and what your reduced number of students you anticipate will be for the next year. Because I think the student population itself should be one of the things that determines the budget. I like teachers, but I don't think the taxpayers who have been hit, and particularly the business taxpayers, but residential taxpayers also who are with lost income should not be hit just to protect teachers' jobs. It's unfortunate, but that's what the priorities have to be. I also think that the unions have to be realistic. They have to change the language in the contract so that you can be in the state plan and have cost savings. And if they don't, you have to be strong and you have to say, we're riffing people. Sorry. You have to play ball with the unions. They have to be economically realistic. We're in an economic crisis. They can't have the Rolls Royce of healthcare and raises on top of step increases, not because they're bad people, not because teachers don't deserve to be compensated and compensated well, but because the tax base just can't deal with that. You have to look for efficiencies. You can't raise the taxes. Some of these businesses are in real trouble. The commercial tax base, which is about 16%, wouldn't surprise me if after tax appeals very shortly, it will be 12% of our tax base. So that's going to mean more on residentials. We have landlords who are on the brink in this town because they don't have tenants paying rent. And we have people who have lost jobs and are wondering if they can keep their home. So tax increases just aren't an option. One other thing, Ken, I did hear you say, what a ripoff when we spoke about charter schools.
Yes.
0.25% of the budget. And my comment is, spoken like the Board of Ed chief of the guy who has the government monopoly on education chartered by the state. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'll start with that one. So here's how the charter school funding works in the state of New Jersey. As you know, every district has a per pupil cost, and that doesn't mean, and ours is, I'm going to use a really round number and say it's around $20,000 a student. That does not mean that if one new student moves to town that it costs us $20,000 to educate that student. What it actually means is that if you take the entire budget and divide it by the number of students, it comes out to $20,000 a kid. Maybe it's 22, 23, it's somewhere in that general vicinity. Let's just say 20. The state law for charter schools says this: if a kid in your town wants to go to a charter school, often because their parent works for a charter school in another town, if a kid in your town wants to go to a charter school, the state takes 90%, John? Is it 90 or 90% of your per pupil cost gets stolen out of your schools and gets given to the charter school. It doesn't cost the charter school $18,000 to add one kid any more than it costs the West Orange School District $20,000 to add one more kid. But anytime a kid in West Orange goes to a charter school, that's $18,000 out of our system and in some charter school's pocket. Could be the best charter school in the world, could be, doing a fantastic job, could be doing a wonderful job as a immersion program or something else, could be set up in a guy's basement somewhere. Doesn't matter. The funding works the same way. So yeah, I'm going to stand by that being a ripoff. The other thing that I'm going to touch personally is the state plan for health insurance. So I think this comes up a lot. And what we do is every year we look and see what the numbers look like for the state plan. In the 3 years that I've been in this process, once the state plan turned out to be a little bit less, but the state plan isn't as good, and the existing contracts, and this is certainly something that could be negotiated at some point, but it takes two sides to negotiate on something, but existing contracts say that any insurance plan is going to be equal or better to the existing insurance plan. So if you switch to a plan that isn't as good, then the board is on the hook to make up the financial difference. You know, in simple terms, if you had a $10 copay and you switch to a plan with a $20 copay, every time somebody goes to the doctor, somebody in the board's cutting them a check for $10 for that copay difference. And that's, you know, the simplest example of what that means. You know, the state plan's got some other issues. One of the bigger ones is that it cycles with the calendar year instead of with the budget year. So with all the other plans, you know what the numbers are looking, you know, in the spring when you're working up your budget in March and April, you know what the increase is going to be year on year, or you know what the change is going to be if you switch insurance plans, and you know that's going to be for the entire year that your budget is good for, from July 1st to June 30th. The state plan always takes its increases in January. So you switch in July and it's a pig and a poke. You don't know what you're going to get in January and what that increase is going to look like. But again, most of the years that we've looked, 2 out of the 3 that I've looked, and you know, I think John can speak to what's gone on in the many years before I was here, because it's only 3 years I've seen, the state plan is usually more expensive and not less expensive. So you're paying more for less coverage. It's not a great deal. If the state plan were equal coverage, or if the state plan were, look, if the state plan were much cheaper and not as good coverage, but we did the math and realized that the make goods wouldn't be such a burden, that would be something that would be considered. I can't say that it would happen, but it would certainly be discussed. It's never been close enough for it to be discussed. That's what I've got on these.
So Ken, just to clarify, just for the community's knowledge, the equal or better than language, that is written into the contract with the unions. So in order for that to be removed, it would have to be negotiated with the union.
Right.
So I just want to make sure that the community is clear that it's not just something that we can go in and just pull out and say, okay, we're going to take this out and now we're going to look at all these.
Right. And the reality is always, in a negotiation, if you want something, you got to give something. So if we want to get rid of equal than better, then, you know, hypothetically, you know, this isn't something that we're discussing. You know, we've started negotiations that we've just introduced so far. But if, you know, if there was a consensus that we wanted to make equal or better health plans go away, then we would have to be prepared, I'm sure, to offer something to make that worthwhile, because it's a give and take.
Right.
Any other comments?
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in on one assertion here. The assertion that taxpayers shouldn't be hit to protect teacher jobs. The process here that we go through is a process of trying to provide an outstanding education to our students. There's not a goal of pitting taxpayers against education. This is a collaborative process. A good, strong educational system in West Orange benefits everybody. So while certainly there's competing priorities and there's budgetary realities, I just want to make sure that it's clear that this isn't an us versus them, at least in my opinion. This is a question of how do we do the best job possible in making sure that we're churning out the best educated students in our community at a price the community can afford.
Yeah, Gary, I would definitely echo that. I think, you know, what our taxpayers are starting to feel is, you know, the pressure of the past 2 years we've increased the taxes, which we're all aware of. And now being hit with COVID, kind of, you know, the financial strain and pressures that everyone's starting to really feel, especially around the holiday season. So I think, you know, this puts us in a very unique position because, you know, we are challenged with the ability, with the fact that there are a lot of competing priorities, like you mentioned, and trying to differentiate where the community sees the priorities being. And obviously that's our student education. And we've always maintained that we don't want to change the landscape of our school district, but at the same time, you know, Mr. Kramer's not necessarily wrong in that we are going to have to make some difficult decisions. And I think Mr. Calavano and Dr. Cascone kind of alluded to that we do have some, you know, we have some heavy numbers here that the community needs to be aware of. But that's also reality for our faculty and district wide, that's not just unique to our community, but something that we all need to be aware of, that these numbers are here. And we are going to have to really get our pencils, you know, to the paper and figure out what to do without sacrificing our students' education.
Do we have a sense of enrollment changes at this point or not yet? Anything official?
we did an analysis of obviously our kindergarten registration will start up in February, so we don't really have any projections on kindergarten. We've to Mr. Kramer's question, we did some analysis on withdrawals, and we had a little over 100 withdrawals, pre-K through 12, since the summer, that we could attest to. Parents who've enrolled their children in some form of an alternate, setting, whether it be private, charter, daycare, whatever, what have you. Homeschooling, we've had a number of parents who've homeschooled their children. So a little over 100.
Now, just like, it doesn't cost us $20,000 to add a student to the system. You don't save $20,000 if you lose a student from the system. But if you lose enough students from a system, and especially if they're in similar grade levels and similar locations, when the annual spring budget crunching season comes upon you, and you're looking at classroom sizes, you start to identify that there may be some efficiencies. So that's something that gets done every year automatically. I wouldn't be surprised if you see more of that this spring. If then again, who knows? You may see people coming back if a vaccine is effective and people feel that school is safe by spring. By the calendar might actually work out that way, that you'll have a sense of it right as people are that making decisions right as you're making the budget.
If I might just add, Mr. Alper, we are in the presence of, in particular on the elementary level, looking at our projections of enrollment by moving the grade numbers up, the student enrollment numbers up to the next grade level, and it becomes a class size. It becomes a conversation about class size. Is really what it comes down to. We can compress sections and save a staff line. And Mr. Calavano, what do we typically estimate the average savings, salary, and benefits for one classroom teacher?
We estimate around 80,000.
80,000. So, if you were looking to save, looking at it as a classroom teaching position, you'd be looking between 70 and 80 positions if you were looking to save that money just in staff lines. So, typically we could find anywhere between, last year we were able to find, I believe, 5 or 6 staff lines by class section reduction without too adversely affecting our class size. We were able to keep our class size at a decent level, but that's really the trade-off, is you can compress sections, but it translates into higher numbers in the classroom. So, and that's typically a phenomenon that has plagued states like California, Nevada, Texas for years, right? Mr. Rothstein, you were a teacher in Los Angeles school district, correct?
I was. I had in most of my classes anywhere between 38 and 45 students.
There you go. So,
and that was in middle school.
Right. So, that's one of the things that has enabled New Jersey to be at the top of the heap, if you will, as far as quality of education, has been that investment, and particularly as it relates to class size, because there is obviously strong research on class size and student achievement, which just makes sense from a conventional wisdom standpoint, but is also supported by the research. So that's the trade-off. Always.
I think it's one of the challenges in general is, our schools are a product, and we're competing with private schools. We're competing with other public schools. Take COVID out of the equation, and just in a normal landscape where everyone's in person, you want to offer a huge broad selection of programs at your high school, because you want people to say, wow, it actually makes sense to stay in West Orange. I don't want to move to Livingston or Milburn, because look at all we've got and look at how great our kids are doing. And it's hard when you get into budget season and you start looking at changes that could adversely affect that, because if you lose the marketing game and you start losing people to your competitors, then as you shrink and you have less enrollment, you have less programs, and you don't want to get into a situation where things are kind of spiraling downward.
I just wanted to jump in about the enrollment. It's extremely fluid right now, because, as you said, parents who may have opted to go out of district right now because of COVID may come back. And then I don't know if any of you got the flyer in the mail today that spoke of how hot the real estate market is in West Orange right now. So people are leaving the city and they're still continuing to come. So I think it's going to be a while before all of that shakes out to know if we've truly lost students versus how many students are actually coming in. And as far as class size, Dr. Cascone, you know, that's something that West Orange has valued for a very long time, smaller class sizes. And as we look at the challenges that lie ahead, that's definitely going to be something that's going to be touched. So,
And
I think just real quick.
no, please.
I think one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that the decisions we make as a school board, when it comes to the budget, don't affect just our members of the community with students in the school district. It also affects our seniors that are in the community, which is a large population. And we're at a point, I think, with the taxes in the community that we're just getting to a point where we're pushing people out. So, you know, I'll use my parents for a perfect example. My family's been in West Orange for over 80 years. And, you know, my parents are getting to the point where it's maybe not worthwhile for them to continue to pay the high property taxes to stay in West Orange. And I think parents are starting now to question, you know, some of the folks that are in these financial struggles or challenges. We are seeing a lot of houses being, you know, going up for sale actually, because folks are considering moving to a district that maybe has less income, less property taxes, and maybe the school district is, you know, not as great as West Orange, but just, you know, maybe up to par with us in our neighboring counties. So I think we also have to keep that into consideration, that how far can we really push our community members in terms of taxes while being fair to our students and providing that, you know, that education that we, you know, are very proud of. And believe me, I don't want to see us change the landscape. I think, you know, I compare West Orange High School to a small junior college. I think we offer so many opportunities for our students, and I would not want to see that change. But I think it's something we still have to be aware of as we go through the budget season, is just how much we can push the taxpayers of West Orange.
I know it probably mostly just eats at the margins and doesn't necessarily make a huge difference financially, but you know, it might be time over the summer heading into the fall to do a fresh re-registration. It's been a few years.
So it's a good idea.
Sorry, can you clarify that or explain that?
Sure. So every few years, the district has every family re-register their students so that, you know, we can be assured that we're educating West Orange students and not, you know, students who aren't living in town. You know, it's an easier, it's a kind of an all at once swoop, as opposed to having to do individual investigations, you know, which of course get done during the course of the year. You know, it also has a little bit of a benefit that, you know, I think the last time they did one of those over the summer, a good number of people just kind of left, right? Rather than going through a process of waiting to be found out or whatever, all right, it's June, we know we have to have this dealt with by September, you know, we've got time to, you know, do what we need to. Anything else?
I see that there are no other hands up in the attendees section. Does anyone else have a question? If you do, please raise your hand and I will call on you. Okay, at this time there's, one more hand up.
That was a hand from the who already spoke in the budget section. So just hang on 1 second and we'll see if we have anybody else for just budget comment. And if not, we'll move on to that final public comment on any topic section. Anyone else for budget? Final call. All right, seeing none. If you have a comment or question on any other topic for a regular, this will not be town hall style, for the regular public comment section, go ahead and raise your hand.
Okay. Calling on Melinda Huerta, if you could state your address for the record, please.
Good evening, Melinda Huerta, 17 Park Drive South. So just going off of enrollment a little bit, I do want to say thank you to Miss Terry Trick Scales. She mentioned, you know, the people from New York moving in, and there's also new developments that are coming to town. And so we do have to look into, you know, not just now and the decrease or the small decrease now, but look at the increases that are potential for the upcoming years. I had a question on how have we seen the virtual learning impact the budget? Have we seen increases or decreases? Any areas where we see, you know, significant decreases where we can keep, or what aspects from this virtual learning are we considering to keep going forward? I do know that a lot of the high school students were flourishing and doing well with the virtual learning to the point where they might consider keeping that version, you know, keeping the online model. So if there are less students in the buildings, could pre-K expansion happen? And could we find spaces if there are less students? Would we be able to shift buildings around maybe? And going off of a little bit with Mr. Alper said with the re-registration, is redistricting an option, or has it been something that is up for discussion? Would that also help with the transportation aspect? With the redistricting, can we get students to the buildings that are closer to them? Can they walk? Can we use less buses? I think that those are all my considerations that I've heard throughout the meeting. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? No one has their hand raised at the time? Questions? All right, I don't see any additional questions.
All right, closing that out. Dr. C, anything on that?
Yeah, it's some interesting questions. Yeah, I don't think that the virtual learning has led to a significant decrease in costs, because when you look at that pie chart that was shared earlier, and then the kind of the spreadsheet, if you will, that Mr. Calavano shared, you'll see that discretionary expenses like instructional supplies represent such a small part of the overall budget. And like, for example, one of our initial strategies for, cutting costs for next year is really just cutting percentages, off the top of all those discretionary lines. We've also seen, as we've had to go to a one-to-one initiative, that we've had to actually invest more money into hardware, because we haven't typically had one-to-one for pre-K through 12, which now we've had to do. In the end, that's been a good thing, because we've been able to fund it partially out of grants. And ultimately, it's just actually added to our inventory, and that will represent a cost savings in terms of the amount of money that we need to allocate in the 2021-22 budget to continue up with our annual lease and purchase of Chromebooks. There has been a several $100,000 savings by virtue of that. We've been able to fund out of grants. I think in terms of when the dust settles on this, how it will, some of like the kind of big systemic changes that it will bring about in public education. In other words, will we start to see, in particular for high school, the kind of the side-by-side operation of kind of a virtual high school versus a brick and mortar high school for those students who want that, or for whom it might work better? I do think that is a possibility. I think it's for the upcoming year. I think we don't have the kind of runway, and we won't have an opportunity to really have the dust settle on this to be able to evaluate it. But I do think that you're going to see that moving forward. And if we were to see something like that, because virtual high schools exist around the country, including in New Jersey, and so they're not a new concept. And so could we potentially have a virtual high school offered specifically to West Orange students? The answer to that question is yes. And if we had a significant number and pulled them out of the building, would be able to reclaim space within the high school and have a preschool connected in some way also to our child development program. I think that's a definite possibility, but I think we're at least a year or two away for being able to realize something like that, because I think the dust needs to settle on this situation for us to really understand how that could work. But I do think that will be something that we'll see on the high school level at some point in time in the near future.
All right. And I guess that wraps this up. Our next meeting is Monday night.
Mr. Alper?
Yes, ma'am.
I think Ms. Huerta had two other parts to her question, one about redistricting and busing.
Yes, John, the demographer. We had originally, was that in, I can't recall, was that something that we originally had in this year's budget? Was it something that we were considering for next year's budget?
Current year budget, and it was there was a cut.
Yeah, so you want to speak to that, Mr. Alper? Or?
So, I think this is another thing that's going to have to wait for the dust to settle, and you're going to have to see what your population looks like in each building, once people are back in their buildings. There's been money talked about for a fresh, because it's needed, demographer study. It would probably be pointless to do it right this minute, but once we're back in school, it would make sense. This one, I would urge the board when it votes on that to not be cheap like maybe was done in the past, and not include things that are in the planning stage but not yet approved, or whatever they left out of that one to save $5,000 because it made the numbers not so useful. But yeah. In terms of, I think there's minor redistricting that happens pretty often on the fringes, like for, kind of under the radar stuff. A couple years ago, some of the streets on the south side of Eagle Rock, like I think Robertson, were moved from Redwood to Kelly, I think, right? Because I think that was one of those situations where, it was just, there was space in one and not space in the other. So that sort of thing happens, fairly frequently. As far as a town-wide sort of situation, I don't know that there's, who knows? You don't know what the populations are going to look like, and if you're going to lose residents in some places or not. I think, as a general principle, I think everybody wants to see kids be able to walk to their own home school, though. So, certainly supportive of that. But you'll have to see where things are once you've got some settling. Then we're back to some normal, which hopefully will be soon. So next meeting, the 21st, Monday night. We'll see you there, and have a good night.